Let's see how the tooltips work. Back on our contact page, let's add a small tooltip to the bottom of our form. So if we find our submit button, we're going to want to add two things here to support a tooltip. The first is we're going to want to specify data toggle again, except the new type we're going to use is tooltip. And we're just going to include a title to show that tooltip. Now at first glance, you may see the Bootstrap documentation for this and go, oh cool, that's easy, I can add these tooltips, and they should just work. If we go over to the browser, and we hover over submit, we're not getting any support for it. And the reason is that the wiring up to each of these elements to show tooltips can be a bit performance intensive. Walking through the entire DOM in order to find tooltips and then use the tooltip functionality in Bootstrap in order to show them can be intensive. So the default implementation in Bootstrap isn't to find every element with a title in it and wire these up. Instead of walking the entire tree, it asks you to actually opt into this by using JavaScript. So we open up that site.js again. Let's do that. Let's go ahead and look for our contact form input type equals submit, because that's the type of control. And then we're just going to call tooltip as the jQuery plugin that Bootstrap supports for doing tooltips. Now when we refresh, if we hover over, we're going to get that tooltip with the style that's shown there. By default, the tooltip's going to be on the top of the container that you're using the tooltip for. And this isn't just for buttons, it could be really for any part of your UI that you want. It's going to give you the capability of making a very simple tooltip. Now you can use JavaScript here to set up certain defaults. Like I could say placement left. And this would change where the tooltip was, in this case showing it on the left. But most of the options that you might use here are also possible directly on the element. Each of those options, if you prefix it with the data-attribute, so in this case placement, we can specify those values directly using attributes on the class instead of having to decorate them and find them where they exist in our JavaScript. This becomes very useful when your call to tooltip is looking at more than one element. Again, if you have tooltips on a lot of elements, you only need to call the tooltip on the collection that jQuery returns. You may find all elements that have a data toggle tooltip as an attribute. And then it will read each element's data attributes to set certain values. For instance, we can say delay and make it not show up for half a second, which is 500 milliseconds. Let's remove the placement here so we don't doubly set it. The tooltip in the code will override any that are inside of the data elements. So now we'll see when we hover over it, it takes about half a second for it to appear and about a half a second for it to disappear. There are some defaults here that you just can't set with the data attributes because they're too complex. Delay is one of these that you may want more control over. So instead of using data delay here, I could do it in the JavaScript like we saw a moment ago, but instead of delay being a single value, we do have support for being able to say show 500, but hide 0. So hide it immediately, but wait to show it. So with those changes, it will take a second to appear, but it will disappear almost immediately. There's no way for us to really describe that using a data-attribute, so sometimes you have to drop down into the JavaScript code anyway. The last thing I'll show you about tooltips is they don't need to be just text. So there is a value called HTML, and if you set that to true, then it's going to expect that the title here is actually a structure of HTML. And let me show you what I mean by that. As for the title, I'm actually going to put an entire piece of markup, in this case an image tag, make sure I get all the quotes collected. This HTML true is going to then expect that this is going to set the value using jQuery's HTML function instead of the text function, which is what it would normally do to set that title. So we look at it now. When I hover, I'm getting that giant image being displayed. We could make it a little nicer by going ahead and adding that class image responsive, which again will guarantee that it fits into a container. And now we're going to get a nice sized container for our image. So by using data HTML equal true, it really allows us to do some very interesting things with how we structure this title. Let's look at alerts next.